Thousands of elven lives ended in the 587th year of the sun in the First Age. The survivors of the drowning of Beleriand called the battle the War of Wrath. They lived only to face a new nightmare, the war against the Orcs. The Maya, which controlled the Orcs, Sauron, sent 2 armies through the land. Their mission? To destroy the leaders of the Last Alliance. The first army was ordered to strike at the Last Alliance in the year 3434, before Sauron was defeated. It failed. The second was set to strike at the Ringbearer himself, when he was still an easy target. As before, the Fellowship was able to send 8 warriors, 8 protectors for Frodo. It was just a question of which one of them would complete their goal first. Welcome back to The Source of the Rings, where we look at the signs, codings, and real-life inspirations behind characters in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Well, the time has finally arrived. We've put it off long enough. It's time to get into the deeply racist stereotypes included in Lord of the Rings. Today, we're going to be talking about the Orcs. We've talked about white savior stories, noble savage stereotypes, and unfortunate implications before, but now we get into something that was racist in both intention and execution. I'd ask that if you're here just to complain about finding racism where it obviously exists, you at least listen to the video first. As for everyone else, let's begin. So, unlike elves, dwarves, and men who have clear canon explanations for their existence, orcs were never given a single definitive origin story. In Tolkien's earliest drafts, orcs were made out of stone. Later on, they were written as elves tormented by Morgoth. For a while, Tolkien considered having them be animals without souls that just resembled humanoids. Alternatively, he thought they might be bred from men and/or elves. No explanation is the certain one, although generally people like the one where it's elves that have been tormented into being orcs. What is known is they came to be as servants of evil, originally of Morgoth, but eventually under the command of Sauron, Saruman, and independent orcish leaders as well, even though most of them remained unnamed. In most battles in Arda's history, if there's a somewhat clear good side and evil side, odds are the evil side had orcs on it. The War of the Jewels, the War of the Elves and Sauron, the War of the Last Alliance, the War of Angmar, the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, and the War of the Ring all featured orcs as the primary, or at least very prominent, forces of evil. I'd like to give more information on their history, but there's ultimately not too much to tell. Basically, when a big bad guy needs an army, it'll primarily be composed of orcs. If there are good-natured orcs in Arda, we don't know about them. Every named orc is described as evil, and every description of an orc leaves little interpretation for a level of morality. The humans in the employ of Sauron are given a few brief passages explaining that they might not necessarily be evil, but rather subjugated or misled. The orcs? No, even without a leader, they will pillage and attack whomever they find. Thus, it is implied that orcs will always be violent, always be nasty, and always be evil. These are things that eventually did trouble Tolkien, as he was quite the theologist. Orcs and goblins in Tolkien's Legendarium are the same thing. An orc is a goblin, and a goblin is an orc. The Uruk-hai are a type of orc, taller than normal, as most orcs are short. All Uruk-hai are orcs, but not all orcs are Uruk-hai. Hobgoblins are very similar, being another larger type of orc. Trolls, though often associated with orcs, are not actually orcs and are quite different, including things like turning to stone in sunlight, being much larger, and potentially being created as a mockery of the Ents, as the way that orcs were a mockery of the elves. Trolls also have a broader display of morality, as the character the Lonely Troll was a kind, generous individual, meaning not all trolls at least were evil. The culture of the orcs is not described in great detail. Perhaps the one thing we know they created by themselves is the battering ram Grond. The artist named the ram after Morgoth's weapon, so there's an element of nostalgia to their art. For weapons, curved swords are common, sometimes referred to as scimitars, though Uruk-hai are known to have used straight swords. Bows and spears are also used. Orcs of Isengard use a white handprint to distinguish themselves, whereas orcs of Mordor use the Eye of Sauron as a mark. Orcs are also talented animal tamers, as they can ride wolves and wargs. Alright, now to the worst part. Did any real-life group of people inspire Tolkien to create orcs? Well, you may have noticed I didn't mention the physical description of Tolkien's orcs, and while the modern fantasy orc is known for green skin and porcine tusks, that's a far sight from what Tolkien wrote. Repeatedly, orcs are described as having dark skin, be it swarthy, sallow, or black, end quote. The Uruk-hai of Isengard refer to the Rohirrim as, quote, white skins, end quote, and are regularly described as bow-legged with eyes detailed in antiquated ways to mean having epicanthic folds. And if all of that wasn't bad enough, in a letter to a film studio about potential adaptations, Tolkien said that orcs should appear as, quote, in fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the, to Europeans, least lovely Mongol types, end quote. I'm not going to insult your intelligence and pretend any of the weasel words in that sentence make this obviously racist statement any less racist. Tolkien made a group of pure evil, ruthless invaders and based them off of Western stereotypes of Mongols. While they may not have been invented as such, originally being stone monsters inspired by European folklore like ogres, jotuns, and of course goblins, along the way Tolkien associated his evil horde with a real-life group of people, and that real-life group of people has faced discrimination for these types of stereotypes. Mongolian people have been demonized and dehumanized for centuries, not just in the West, but throughout Asia as well. Any continuation of this trend is not only reprehensible, it's dangerous. While the direct comparison wasn't released to the public until well after the books were published, whether he intended to or not, and I reckon given his track record with real-life white supremacists of his day, he probably didn't, Tolkien's depiction of orcs and the portrayal of them in adaptations have been happily accepted by white nationalists and supremacists as stand-ins for people of color, be it East Asians due to the direct comparison that Tolkien himself made, or black people due to the description of skin color. The sheer amount of Orientalist and anti-black sentiments associated with orcs in this fandom is immense and very discouraging. Tolkien was racist. His white supremacist fans, even though he tried to disassociate himself from them, took his use of stereotypes and made them even more racist. There is no way around this. There is no excusing it. The heroic characters of color in Lord of the Rings and the rest of the works of Tolkien don't make the racism disappear. Individuals that find this to be a deal-breaker, who refuse to engage with Lord of the Rings because of this racism, are more than justified, and fans that try to dissuade them from their distaste by saying they're overreacting or need more context are only continuing in the same tradition of fandom gaslighting that is so commonly seen when an author is openly racist, and are in fact engaging in racism themselves. For those that would want to salvage the story, what could be done to decode the orcs, remove the racist stereotypes, and distance them from their hateful origins? Well, if you have any ideas yourself, I certainly welcome you to share them. I'm not going to pretend that as a white man I know the perfect way to correct these caricatures, so please feel free to comment. As for myself, I have had some ideas, and I've seen a couple others. Now, none of these ideas are perfect, and they certainly don't excuse how Tolkien crafted the orcs, but they're what I've got. My favorite idea would be to revert to Tolkien's earliest writings of orcs, which were made out of stone, had minimal dialogue, and were ultimately more like automatons than humans. Have their skin be gray, as is the case with the trolls, and get rid of all of the stereotypical features. By not being coded as human at all, you avoid coding them as any group of people. Now, artificial humanoids can still be coded. I'm not saying this is a miracle cure, but this would be a step in the right direction. Alternatively, I've seen it suggested that if the orcs are corrupted elves, and, as Tolkien said in a personal letter, resembling corrupted versions of Mongols, this would mean that elves would, through logic, be coded as Mongols. Given that elves first arrived in the far east of Middle-earth, this isn't necessarily without potential coding. In fact, coincidentally, the first elf to awaken, Imin, shares a name with a river in Inner Mongolia. The argument is also that this would humanize the orcs and make them more obviously sympathetic if you show the connection to the elves. Still, though, this could easily default on stereotypes, as, like I said, having heroic characters of color doesn't make caricatures any less harmful. This could potentially work, but I personally think it's something that could only work with Mongolian people as the majority of the storytellers. It's not really the place for someone who is not Mongolian to try to use Mongol stereotypes, even if the goal is to subvert them. I've also seen it argued that orcs should be coded as white, and I think in general if you are white and want to make an evil species in your fiction, coding them as a people group of color is always going to be a bad idea. Coding them as white is going to be preferable. That said, I still have seen people code their evil races as white and still manage to be hateful, be it by coding them as Ashkenazi Jewish, immigrants, lower class, etc., etc. I'm not saying there wouldn't be a way to code the Orcs as white without it being problematic. There were times where Tolkien himself coded the Orcs as English industrialists, but it once again would not be a magical solution without any problems. But still, as I said, whatever efforts that are made to curtail Tolkien's racist coding for his Orcs do not make up for that racism in the first place. I'm not saying you can't like The Lord of the Rings, I still love it myself. I'm not saying Tolkien was without morality as a human being. In separate letters, he opposed racism on a personal, case-by-case basis. But this idea, this coding, is racist, and this racism, which equates East Asians with violent, corrupted invaders, is dangerous, as I'm sure you well know. You can enjoy content without making excuses or defenses for the places that it dehumanizes others. With that being said, as I said in the video, how would you rewrite Tolkien's Orcs? I appreciate any comment. Thank you for listening.